panel session to be moderated by Limor Pierre. Limor Pierre is the Associate Director for Research at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. She oversees research infrastructure and process at ISPS, including the Field Experiment Initiative, which encourages field experimentation and interdisciplinary collaboration in the social sciences. In this capacity, she's led the creation of a specialized research data repository, the ISPS Data Archive. Limor also serves as a research data policy specialist in the Office of the Provost and is working on campus-wide efforts relating to research data.
And she has the coolest first name.
So I'd like to keep this as informal as possible. This is the end of the day, and I think we've all heard a lot and have a lot to digest and a lot to process. And by the way, speaking of digestion, if anyone wants to go and grab a cup of coffee, that's fine. So I'm thinking of this as just as a conversation. I mean, from my point of view, I would just like to sit back and let these guys talk among themselves and just listen to that. I think that's where we're going to try to go. But I did want to say just maybe a few things in the beginning. First, just to thank you all for agreeing to do this today. I think that we're very fortunate to have this stellar panel we couldn't ask for a better set of keynote speakers and folks who can really make the case for open science. That I think a lot of people in this room are supporting, and that we are all sharing the mission that we need to spread the word and get it out and make real change fast. All of these speakers also lead by example, and they've made open science and research transparency a priority alongside their academic careers, which I find quite amazing. And I think they should be saluted for that. So we've heard about the work of the Center for Open Science, the Open Science Framework, the Reproducibility Project. We've heard from Erin about her advocacy work, her personal pledge, and the work she does to educate researchers. And we've heard from Harlan. Harlan's a leader in open data and clinical trials, and the Yoda Project, and some other things related to that. We heard a lot about the benefits of openness to science as a whole. I really liked Brian's, I think it was yesterday's talk at the psychology department, about your motivation for starting this whole thing was realizing that there's a gap between how we idealize science and how we actually practice it. And that, and being a psychologist, kind of realizing some of the reasons for that gap having to do with things like biases and human nature. But then coming up with a way to kind of try to tackle that and reduce that gap. So benefits for science, doing science better, benefits for scientists. So things that will improve their career and make it better for them. And better for society, and better for research subjects, which I think didn't quite come up as much, but I know that it's one of the things that Harlan really works on as well. So I guess I want to just throw out a question to you to bring it back to some of the remarks that Steve Gervin made. It seems like a long time ago, but it was this morning. So because open science really it's an ecosystem, and we have a lot of players. We have researchers, we have academic societies, we have institutions, we have funders, we have industry, we have journals, we have libraries, and we have technology and other support services. I want to ask you to zoom in on the institutions for a minute, because you know, if we're talking about fast progress in this area. Maybe some of these stakeholders have gone faster than others if we charted them out. What are your thoughts about where institutions are in this sort of progress? And especially in light of some concerns that I have coming from in the US. It's different, for example, in the UK, where some of the national policies inform the research councils, and then the research councils tell the universities what to do when they have to do it. We don't really have that, and the recent statements from the, Association for American Universities might lead one to believe that there is maybe a little some resistance in how the universities see themselves complying with some of the federal mandates for opening up data. So that's my question. I'll let you go with that. And let's see how we go.
Anyone want to jump in here? Let's see. So, yeah, so I think, it depends a lot what institution you're looking at. So some institutions have been great in kind of pushing things forward. But I think what I would love to see more from institutions is a better match between what they say they value and what they're actually rewarding. So, yeah, so a lot of institutions have these very explicit mission statements that say, we value communicating science, we value reaching out to the public, we are a public institution that should be interacting with citizens. But at the time where we're evaluating researchers for hiring or promotion and tenure, we're not giving them credit for communicating their results to the public or sharing their results. We're giving them more points for locking it up in a journal like Nature and Science than we are for dissemination. And so I would love to see more initiatives from institutions to have a better mismatch, to reform their evaluations and start valuing some of these things more and really kind of, meet their mission statements. Because I think that this is something that we can all agree. Reaching out to the public should be a good thing and should be something that an academic institution is doing. But if we're just locking up these results in journals and we're furthermore writing it in language that the public can't understand, that's not reaching out to the public in any way. So I think a lot of institutions have been very cautious, and every department says, no, we're a unique snowflake and we can't possibly have kind of general recommendations about how we could reform evaluation. But I think we have to think a lot more about those things.
Yeah, I totally agree with the aligning incentives with what the goals are for the institutional mission and scholarship, as Erin describes. Another element of where I think institutions still have work to do is on the infrastructure side, is in finding ways to actually integrate the tools and services for doing science more openly with the researcher's workflow. So just as an example, I have never once used the institutional repository at University of Virginia. I'm probably among the more committed people to open science at the University of Virginia, and I've never used it because it is not at all linked to the workflows in my lab. It never comes up to think, oh, I should deposit my articles in our institutional repository. If the, and I raised this with some colleagues in the library, and they say, oh, that's probably a good idea, because they said, oh, and no one else uses our repository either. And I mentioned that the way that you can get me to use the repository is each year I have to submit an annual report of all the research that I did. Of course, it's in a Word document, and I cut and paste from my Vita what the work was, which is a problem on its own. But if instead, during that reporting process, it just said, add your papers, right? It was a little web form, and I'm dropping my papers in, and that automatically put them into the institutional repository, then everybody's papers on campus would be in the institutional repository. Why? Because we fill out that form because we want our raise. So it's in our workflow. We have a reason to do it. And so you have to think about what is it that actually engages people in the workflow that they have in order to get them to use the services that the organization is providing, right? Just saying do it isn't sufficient.
Yeah, so the University of Liège, I think in Belgium, is actually doing this. So it's a requirement now that if you want any product, any research product considered for promotion and tenure, it has to be in their open access institutional repository. And there was this great quote, actually just a few hours ago on Twitter, that said, from the NIH director, that said, if you want to herd cats, the best way is to move the food bowl. And so this idea of being, incentives are important. So if you tell them your raise depends on this, your promotion and tenure depends on this, they're going to do it. It's not just build it and they will come. They won't come unless you give them a reason to come. So,
And then there's another add-on to that, which is recognition that most researchers are not concerned with open science. And that's not saying researchers are opposed to open science. It's that the concern of the researcher is the problems that they're trying to solve. the questions that they're investigating in the lab. So I have a great test case for all the things that we do at the center. My test case for whether this is going to work at all is whether my wife gets interested in it. She runs a lab at UVA, and most of the time she has no interest at all in what we're doing because she's trying to figure out the cognitive processes underlying anxiety disorders and fixing that. That the papers are available open access, well, that's fine. Yeah, I hope other people will be influenced by it, but it's not what she thinks about every day. And so it's another one of those occasions of presuming that she's totally pro open science in the principles, but because she's not thinking about it in terms of the practices, what we have to provide is easy way to live by those principles so that she can stay focused on the things that are the problems she's trying to solve. And so any institutional process has to be attentive to what's actually driving the person's behavior and how do we just become part of that. Don't add on to the workflow, integrate with their workflow.
So these are interesting suggestions. I guess I'm looking for you, Brian, as a psychologist, is to think about, how do you create, how do you make it normative in a way that isn't top-down requirement, but recognizing that your wife or others will, see this as not just the right thing to do, but actually making their lives richer and better. I mean, and you start thinking about what some of the pain points are. I mean, what some of the pain points are, you spend all this time doing a paper, it's a static paper, and I think a lot of them are confetti papers. They get a little attention for a little bit of time, and then they sort of fall away. They don't nearly get the eyeballs that they could get, or aren't getting to the right audiences that might foster the kind of commentary and push you to better work and actually help you see solutions. And in the beginning, as investigators, I think we're taught, like, hold everything tight. I'm the one with the ideas. I'm like, and it's only through collaborative efforts where you say, like, I never would have come up with this idea if I hadn't had some sort of resonance with somebody else who was sort of challenging me, or that the group hadn't been able to do that. And so I guess I have this wish to think that we can create the tools so that it gets out there and fostering communities and interactions that never would have existed. And then in some way you're able to also, it's not just about citations, but it's actually about energy that's generated around ideas, and that we're, because otherwise we're producing papers and they get forgotten really quickly, and in part because they never get to people who it might spark. The most excitement I get is when someone says, I read one of your papers and it led me to do something else. And, I just know that a lot of people are shielded with access. If I think about the world, right? I mean, certainly in our country, if you're associated with the university, you're going to get access to a lot of this stuff. But there are a lot of people around the world who may not be able to be exposed to some of these ideas because of, the way and the cost and so forth. And so we have to think about ways of making these cases that it creates a more vibrant community, more satisfying career in life, and that it actually is going to produce, even for you, better science. And I know that may be a pipe dream, but it's something about feeding into that, because I do believe if it feels like one more darn thing, I've got to, because it seems like every year as faculty we're asked to do more compulsory training on something. You've got to, the list is like this, you've got to, I got to take all these online assessments, and, it just, they don't feel energizing, and I don't necessarily feel like it's improving my competence or making me better at anything. I'm just someone's checkbox. And I think the degree to which this becomes somebody's checkbox because we're telling them it's making things better, rather than finding out ways that we can authentically do that, and that's what I was asking you when we met before, how do we know the science has gotten better? We need to be able to say this is a tool for the end game. The end game is we're actually better at producing science. Like if we go through all of this and on the other side we're just the same as we are now, then all we've done is create a lot of extra work. And so we got to figure out how does it actually enhance the output, make it either more efficient or more clever. And that's, I think, our central challenge, so that we're not just sitting here telling people it's the right thing to do, we're going to put in these regulations, but that we're saying it's a competitive advantage. Last thing I'll say about this is, because I say that I have this same conversation in medicine around decision support tools. A lot of the docs are saying it takes too long to engage in decision support, like I'm smart enough, I memorized all this stuff. And what you want to say is once they can start looking at their outcomes, it's like the athletes. You don't see any of the athletes saying, somebody's got a new training regimen that ends up making them faster. Everyone else wants to figure out what that is. I mean, you like that they stay legal, but I mean, on the Olympic side, like, you want to give yourself every advantage for performance. And what I want this is to be performance enhancing. And if this becomes performance enhancing, then things will fall into place. And then give credit for that. I mean, that's part of it, performance enhancing in what your job is as a member of the community too. But if it's performance enhancing, I think people will run to it. If it seems like it's another weight tied around my legs that's making it hard for me to swim because I just don't have enough time to do my research anymore because I'm spending 40% of my time complying with all these mandates, then I don't think it's a long-term winner. Anyway, that's just my general ideas about it.
Yeah, these are real good issues to identify and to take one step back and then go into it. The presumption of training, and this is an academic presumption by and large, is that we have to persuade people, change their attitudes and beliefs, and their behavior will follow. Most of the evidence suggests it's a lot easier to do the reverse. Change the behavior, and their attitudes and beliefs will follow, right? So set the conditions so that the behaviors happen naturally, right? Not that I have to do all this extra work or fill out all these extra forms or think about this new process, but give me a tool that makes it easy for me to do something that I already want to do. I'm not persuading you about anything. I already want to
All
collect
things
my
being
data.
equal, I want to do it.
Right. And then all of a sudden, it also adds on this other thing. Oh, it turns out my research is more reproducible because I use this tool that was an awesome analytics tool, and all the code spit out, and then it put it on this website, and then someone else clicks go, and all of the results come out again. Oh, that's cool. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm glad that's there. Oh, I believe in reproducibility, right? So the key for these is not let's build a persuasion campaign and convince people that despite the incentives of the system, despite the inconvenience, despite all these forms you have to fill out now, it's a good thing to do. Instead, focus on the tools. How do we insert ourselves into their workflows so that they can just do it and then persuade themselves? And the other part of that is that there isn't persuading that's needed in the ultimate end game, because you noted that people are saying, I need to hold this for myself. I'm resisting, but simultaneously, I want to have influence, right? Everybody wants to have influence, right? What is an academic's success? It's reputation, right? If an academic went into science to make money, they made a bad career choice, right? They could make lots of money in other ways more easily. The academic's real thing is reputation. How do we get reputation? We have influence, we have impact, people pay attention to what we're doing. Being closed in different parts of the process interferes with that. But the reason that we feel like we need to be closed is because the entire mindset is about, I need to be closed to get the publication. The publication is my means to reputation enhancement. And so the breaking that system is breaking the publication as it is the bottleneck. Everything is about the publication. And if you can break that bottleneck, then I get impact, I get attention, I get interest, I get people talking to me about stuff is now open. The entire process is an opportunity for me to have impact, for other people to pay attention to what I'm doing. How I design my study, other people start to say, oh, that's a really interesting question, let me help. Or, oh, that question is now inspiring me to do this thing, right? And it's no longer interfering with me to have used her to take my ideas earlier, because it's not about the publication anymore. It's about me influencing you, wherever I am in the research cycle.
Where do you see this going? Say that we're successful to some extent and at some point, and we have more and more demand for open science from our funders and maybe from researchers themselves, and more supply. We know that that's coming. Are there what unforeseen problem might be something that we're not thinking about right now that might come up that has to do with open science because it seems that the way we're thinking about it is it solves a lot of problems and it's a good thing, but are there some problems that it could create that we should maybe think about?
So yeah, I think we've touched on some of the issues, right? Privacy issues. There might be times where disclosing certain information is not good for the patient. So I think those are kind of the more obvious cases. I think one that I hear a lot and I don't necessarily have a good answer for is simply too much information. So if you're trying to keep up with a certain field, there are already too many articles being published for me to keep up with that. If you're going to add preprint literature to that and data sets and protocols and all kinds of interim research products that we think it's a good thing to release those, there's a filtering issue. So I can't process all of that information. How are we going to put some types of filters in place that allow us to pick out the stuff that's most relevant to us and go with that? So I think that's not yet an issue we've entirely solved. I don't think that should. I don't think that. Sorry. Yeah, I know. So I don't think that should prevent us, right, from going forward. But I think it's something that we're going to have to think of going forward. Yeah.
Well, I see a day where we're, solving problems together. Nobel Prizes don't go out to, 3 or few people, but they recognize the team nature of this science and that we, that we're each trying to push forward. But, I do think we come back to this issue about, in the end, there is some curation that's going to be needed. So how does that curation occur? I was saying to Brian, in my field, there are very small but highly vocal people around particular issues that represent outliers. Now, not saying their voice doesn't deserve to be heard, but for example, people are anti-vaccine. They could threaten the public's health. And should they have an opportunity to express opinion? Sure, but if you've got a small number of people pelting the comments in disproportionate fashion, you can have a misappreciation of what the community is thinking. So how you curate this, what represents a danger if the information is getting out in a certain way? How do you control what really should be reasonable discourse? That is, one side does think the other side's crazy, the other side thinks the other side's crazy, but actually both of them we don't know who's right yet, right? Versus one where there's a group that's truly an outlier opinion that potentially could threaten the public's health by, saying something that, is everyone should be taking cyanide tablets. I don't know. Something, this is a cure for cancer, like they did for apricot pits for a while. But the question is how to curate that. And I think the issue of credit does come down because we can't ignore this. So we've got a university, someone's trying to build a career. I want to give her credit for the influence. I want to give her a special credit if she produces data that other people are using. I want to consider that even better than a citation because that study never would have been possible if you hadn't produced that data. But, the institutions are slow to move, and we're slow to understand how to measure that influence. So when a junior person's coming up, doing good work, being extraordinarily generous, adopting this kind of approach, I worry. Like, how are we going to make sure that we can keep up with that and not lose that talent because they're early adopters of what is really the right thing to do? And I think those are issues that we're going to have to figure out.
I agree with all those. They cover a lot of the broad domain. I think for me, the umbrella issue is that the biggest risk is being comfortable with the status quo. Whatever change we make to now it's open, now it's this, we're done. That is the wrong method. We have to have, I think, in order for this to be effective, an actual discipline of meta-science emerge that is truly the interdisciplinary discipline, which is a constant evaluation and iteration, refinement of the process of scholarly communication and research. Without that, we will not identify unintended consequences, and we will fail to improve the ones where things are actually not operating as efficiently or effectively as they could.
Beautifully said.
One challenge that comes to my mind when I hear that is, because I've been around librarians for a long time, is the preservation of these materials and the usage of them in the long term. And what are your thoughts on that? Who is responsible for that?
Who is responsible for preserving? Yeah. I don't know. producing multiple terabytes a second, is mind-blowing for thinking about preservation of data. But there are lots of interesting solutions that are emerging and will continue to emerge. And so to me, the problem right now is to get to the point where we have a problem with actually preserving the data we need, because that would be a great problem to have, right? So the one solution that we've been exploring with some prototypes is using torrents models for data preservation. So torrents are usually used for teenagers to share movies when they're not supposed to, but they can be used for good purposes, which is every machine has a bit of space that's dedicated to hosting data. And so I donate a few gigabytes of my hard drive, and you donate a few gigabytes of yours. It distributes it, and it is a great preservation device because you can get many, many copies in many different places and track those copies really easily. For preserving the origins of things, the blockchain has lots of interesting potentials for provenance and registration and things like that. So there's technologies constantly emerging that can help solve some of the problems. And then what data to get rid of, right? And then museums have a whole history of thinking about what is a decision process for deciding what to preserve, because we can't preserve it all. So I worry less about that in the sense that, yeah, when those are real problems, we figure out how to solve those problems. CERN is a great example of having lots of real principled decisions about when and how to get rid of data. Decide to just drop it because it's not what needs to be preserved.
Let's open it up to everyone.
My question is about preprints, because it sounds like there are more and more possibilities to submit a preprint, and I think for most of us, the traditional peer review process is really painful, and I always think the reviewers they feel forced to come up with really crazy ideas or be really creative in suggesting impossible experiments. Sometimes it's to really improve the publication, sometimes it's not. At least that's my opinion. But so back to preprints, do you think, is there any evidence that submitting a preprint would really accelerate the time of until the actual publication of a manuscript? And the second question is if there is the fear that reviewers will also look at some of the suggestions published in these preprint services and just come up with even more ideas so that you end up doing more experiments. At the end, the publication will be very long. We'll probably have a lot of authors. It will be much better than the first manuscript, but at the end, it will be very time-consuming and also very costly to finish it.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know if there's ever been a controlled study that looked at whether manuscripts that had been published on a preprint server go through the peer review process faster, for example, than ones that weren't submitted to that type of platform. I mean, my anecdotal experience is just that having those eyes on the paper and getting a lot of community feedback before I submit to peer review has helped me clean up a lot of issues, tackle kind of the biggest issues in my papers. And I felt like the peer review process after that then has gone very smoothly. So again, that's not a controlled study. It's anecdata, but for me, that's my personal experience that it has made. So this recent paper that we wrote together, so we actually opened that up on Google Docs and invited people to come in and give comments. And that allowed us to kind of identify and really tackle major issues. And then the peer review process at the journal went fairly quickly. So.
I don't know if there's ever been a systematic study on preprints. I can't think of one, but that would be an awesome thing to do for exactly the reasons you identify, because that would be interesting, right? You can come up with plausible stories in both directions, the positive story and accelerating, but the interference story as you describe it. So that's a study worth doing.
So the only studies I am aware of on preprints is some of the citation studies surrounding preprints, right? So in physics and mathematics, especially the articles that were published on arXiv prior to journal submission and publication, obviously they started to get citations sooner because they were available sooner, but then they maintain the citation advantage for months or years afterwards. So that's an obvious visibility benefit for researchers. Whether there are costs that kind of outweigh that, I'm not sure. I'm not sure those things have been measured.
I have both a comment and a question. The comment is about getting more and more open data and open access applications that we can use. Kind of overlook one big group of people next to going into society, which are the groups that are not in an Ivy League university. I know that I'm very privileged with my whole education system, and visiting universities or colleges that want to use and want to partake in hypothesis and research, and I'm using, for example, MATLAB or Mathematica, and they don't have that. That's why I think it's also a very important thing to emphasize that we as researchers from such a privileged university should also emphasize that we have our colleagues at other universities that really benefit from it, but we need to be the drivers because, to be fair, they do look up to us. So if we are the first one to implement it, they definitely will follow. And that was my comment. My question is more about, we already were discussing that and we're going into that direction in a way that what we see now and what's also now in public debated is when everything is open and we get facts and news, how are we going to deal with that social way of who is going to pick what is right information and what is the right kind of data or research we're going to follow? Because we do see that now in public news sharing, these kind of things, but that probably is also a consequence of having all this open data and all this kind of open research debating. Because if we don't have a curated list there anymore, what is then, we base then why certain people get popular on prejudices of others. So my question is, how do you want to tackle that instead of curating or maybe not curating the whole open access?
Both good comments. I'll address the first, and you guys can answer the second. I think something that's often overlooked, and we did in our discussions by and large here, although not completely, I think Erin made some good points, is that open science isn't just about transparency. Openness also means inclusivity, right along the point that you made, which is it really breaks down barriers that are because of unequal resource distribution. So one of the questions earlier was about doing studies in multiple samples, right? Samples vary, especially human samples, and so we need to look at variation in those effects. We have organized many labs projects where we take the same protocol and invite any lab that wants to run it to run the exact same protocol to investigate that very question. And those kinds of studies have been very popular among groups that are in institutions that don't have dedicated research resources. And the faculty are spending most of their time teaching rather than having time to do research. And the reason is that they have passion and interest and expertise in doing research. They just don't have resources or grad students or other things to do a generative research program, starting from scratch and building up the ideas and blah, 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 blah. But to be able to participate, if another group is saying, okay, we'll organize these materials, we'll organize the protocols, and then you're just going to, your role is like this, but it's a real role. It is a meaningful role, has dramatically expanded inclusion in that regard. Same thing with open data. I gave a talk at University of Belgrade a couple of years ago, and when I was talking to the graduate students, they were all doing research in my subdomain, implicit bias. So why are you guys all studying implicit bias? And they said, well, all the people in your subfield put their papers online, and so we can get them. So that's why we study implicit bias. Like, oh my gosh, okay, wow, makes me feel like I'm going to continue doing that. And why aren't other people making their papers available? You know, so there's these inclusivity aspects I think are easy to underappreciate when you have resources already. You don't realize what the barriers are to getting access to things. So, the hard question.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, I just wanted to second that. So I work in Mexico, and I'm fairly fortunate to work at UNAM, which has pretty good resources and fairly good access to literature. But I did previously work in an institution that had almost no access to the literature, and saw what that did on a daily basis to our ability to teach students, our ability to do research. And so when you do see that on a daily basis, it really hits home the importance of what we're talking about here. And with respect to open data specifically, you hear a lot of concerns. In Mexico, we have limited finances for research. So every little piece of data that I can get is so crucial, and I have to suck all the juice out of that. So why would I share it with somebody? On the other hand, if other researchers are sharing their data, I might be able to get access to data sets that I couldn't possibly collect where I am, because there's no way I'm going to have the funds for that type of equipment. So neural recording, I'm not going to have fancy neural recording. I'm trying to scrap together a patch clamp rig right now, and it's, you know, we're pulling things out of closets, and that's the kind of level that we're at right now. So there's that flip side to it. I could get a very significant benefit from people outside opening up their data, but there has to be some kind of reciprocation, right? That's the problem. You know, I'm kind of stalling here because your second question is really not an easy one to answer, which is why I was bringing it up as a potential concern going forward, this filtering issue. How do you decide what's important and what's not important, and how do you kind of put weights to that? So a lot of people previously, well, number of citations. Okay, well, that's a fairly poor metric. Journal impact factor, even worse, because it's a journal level metric. It doesn't say anything about the actual individual piece of work. And so there have been a lot of efforts around altmetrics. So can you kind of get a bigger picture of how much impact a piece of work is having? So tweets and Facebook and news media coverage and things like that, and try to get quantitative and qualitative idea of how big an impact a piece of work is having, and then have some type of ranking based on that. And a lot of people get very concerned that, well, you can game these metrics. Well, you can game citation counts too. And citation counts, to a certain extent, are also popularity contests, right? So labs get popular, those names get big, and you cite that one just because it has the big name versus somebody who might have made a similar discovery around the same time. So I think there's not an easy answer, but there's a lot of people like Impact Story who are working on how we might get a broader picture of an impact of a piece of work, and then work on ranking and filtering. We had somebody who presented earlier on this idea of upvoting or downvoting, and then commenters can sort of build their reputation over time, a Reddit type system. That I think is also interesting. So I don't think we have a solution, but I think there are a lot of very smart people working on these problems. So I hope that they will have a better answer for you than I do in a couple of years from now. So.
Oh, I'm kind of like Brian was on that other issue, which is I think it's going to get solved. Look, I think all the consumer sites are kind of working on this, figuring out how do you manage the gaming, how do you, and I think what we have to realize is we have to get away from an omnibus kind of score, but it's like, you know, who's it influencing? Where is it good for? Even for you, you're interested in the curation. It's like you may want to be interested in scores from certain kinds of people or certain ways it's being done. I mean, I see this as moving fast. People are going to come up with a lot of different ways. You'll have, I think, a lot of options. The question will be the demand. So as this starts spreading and we're starting being inundated by the amount of possibilities, then there's going to be demand to try to come up with ways to customize what you want, and also for you to understand who's making use of it and how it's going. I think it could become more democratic in a way, because you're right. I mean, and there's plenty of studies showing this whole thing about citation is totally flawed. I mean, certain things get hot, and they actually, in my field, people aren't even reading the literature anymore. So, like, you know, there are papers that either we publish, other people publish, that we think are important, and they're totally ignored in the papers. They're just sort of like doing a quick look. Maybe they're looking at the last paper that was published and pulling out some stuff from their reference section and just moving forward. And I'm seeing actually less thorough understanding of what the literature is, a great need sort of to improve that. And I know adding more is not going to be the solution to. But I think the status quo is a big problem, and so the popularity contest here isn't necessarily merit-based. It's sort of name-based, and so we're going to have to figure out what it is that it's going to move us forward.
Yeah, we are overwhelmed with information in every part of our lives, and there's a lot of commercial organizations whose business model depends on good filtering of that for their success, right? When I go to New York, I use Yelp, and most of the time, the restaurant I go to is like, oh yeah, that was a good choice. So then I continue to use Yelp.
What you really want to know is how a person like you. I mean, I feel like that on Flickster and all those things. I mean, they need to get better too, or Rotten Tomatoes. I don't care what the average Rotten Tomato score is. I want to know people who like the movies that I like what it is. They haven't begun to customize that yet, but they will.
Yeah.
And, in 5 years, no one's ever going to see like, well, this is the average Rotten Tomato score. It's really popular because all the people that rated it like that kind of movie. They all went to it and they all rated it. And, I think in our field, it'll be the same thing. And I think what we'll have to be careful about is not getting in a bubble where all of a sudden our interests, and we just feed us stuff. So we have to be able to say, we also want the random one coming our way that somehow tickles you, right? So all this stuff, though, I think will get worked out.
So I think something else we have to be vigilant about is who controls these tools, who controls this infrastructure. So
I think we should.
yeah, well, right. So there are, yeah. Oh no. But I mean, there are. You mentioned commercial entities. So there are publishers right now that are trying to latch on to the idea that open is becoming popular, and use that to gain financially. There was a particular publisher that was getting into the metrics game in terms of research or evaluation. So and the problem is that because these are closed tools and closed systems, for example, we don't know, is that publisher weighting their journals heavier than other people's journals? We don't know because we can't see inside that. Thomson Reuters has been controlling impact factor for...
We should boycott all of that.
Yeah, and we should, and there are lots of people who have. I mean, there's the San Francisco...
Like Yale would take the lead on that.
So this would be fantastic. So how many people have heard of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, SF-DORA? So this is a statement that says we are essentially boycotting impact factor. We're not going to use it in any hiring, promotion, tenure evaluation. And it's got like over 12,000 individual signatories and I think 900 organizations. But if places like Yale then sign this and then act on it, right? Because it's not just going and signing it. It's signing it and then saying, we're going to remove the mention of impact factor in all of our tenure and promotion guidelines. We're going to explicitly say that committees are not supposed to look at this when evaluating candidates for new positions, that type of thing. So yes, we should boycott these things as individuals, as institutions, and be very vigilant. Who's controlling this infrastructure? And are we able to see inside it and see what's going on? So I think that's why it's so important that, for example, you guys are building tools that are open source and people can see what's under the hood and people can grab it and
Facebook?
modify.
What should we do with Facebook?
I'm not going there. You guys can touch that one.
But Brian and I were talking about this, though, about I totally agree with you about that. I was just raising this other issue, though, about these fake news groups and all this. I mean, this is where I think how this stuff there will be need for some curation. And so how that gets done, who does it, and the degree of transparency around how it's done. I mean, all these are going to be important facets, I think.
And I'll just say I think that could be a role for the university to do because it knows its researchers, it knows the domains, and that could be a gatekeeper in that way, as well as a leader. That's another good role for institutions. Karen, do we have time for one more? Yeah.
You have the final word.
Well, this is really just a follow-up of the curation question. Just, do you think artificial intelligence has any role in that, in terms of kind of like, equivalent to decision support or Watson trying to, make judgments about what's, valid and not valid?
Yeah, and how far it can go, who knows? If it can start writing my papers for me, all the better. But there are lots of interesting advances that are looking for relationships that are hard to detect. The Allen Institute has some interesting new tools along those lines about the scientific literature. So yeah, I think there's lots of potential there.
Yeah, so we were just discussing text and data mining yesterday at the poster session and kind of how quickly those tools are advancing. So the content mine, for example, is one project. So their goal is to extract 1 million facts from the literature. Well, I can't do that by hand, but the amazing kind of text and data mining tools that they're developing can. And also, I was looking into the project with them on image mining. So we have all these neural traces in the literature. And right now, if I want to get an idea of the diversity of that, I have to go one paper at a time and look at those figures. And it's just a ridiculous task to do manually, especially if now I have to consider all the preprint literature and all the published literature and maybe open data sets as well. But as we're developing new text and data mining tools, not me, them, you can extract this information. So they had this really nice kind of proof of concept demonstration where they were able to pull out the data, recreate the data from a figure and put it back into a spreadsheet that now you could analyze and play with. And so the potential for that, I think, would be incredible if we could do large-scale analyses and comparisons across neural traces or across other types of chemical structures or things like that that we can't do manually. So.
And I just don't think there's any choice. It's going to be that way, but there'll be performance enhancers. I don't think they'll replace. There'll be guides, different tools people can use.
I'm not an AI expert myself, but what I've read is there's some concern even among those experts about the black box effect because algorithms have gotten so complex and sophisticated that it becomes difficult to go back and validate what comes out, the output of this at times.
Okay. Thank you all.
So in addition to thanking the keynotes, I actually wanted to give a round of applause for all the speakers we had today. It was just some fantastic talks.